Hey there, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I got another product review for you here on the channel today. This time around, I'm checking out the SG14 Mini-ITX Chassis from SilverStone. This is one I'm personally very excited about. I know a lot of you have been looking forward to this review as well. I'm honored to say I have one of the very first samples available in the United States, but I do know these should be reaching retail shortly, hopefully by the time this video goes live. Now, the retail price of this chassis is $110, which puts it in a completely different product class than the venerable SG13 chassis that I've profiled extensively here on the channel. That's still a current SKU, and you'll still be able to get that chassis if you want a low-cost case that's extremely small at 11.5 liters. This is much larger at 20 liters, but it does allow you to do a lot of things you could never dream of doing in the SG13. Now, I happen to know that Silverstone has been working on this chassis for many years. I've personally seen 3 different prototypes of it at CES, starting in 2017 when I saw a glass enclosed version that was vertically oriented with lots of RGB lighting. That was, of course, the trend at the time. Well, tastes have changed since then. What the ITX market demands now is great thermal performance, and that's what this has in store for you. I will, of course, be putting it to the test with my test bench, and we will see how it works out versus a lot of other ITX chassis that I have tested over the past year, but I believe that this really will do quite well. Now, another thing that's changed quite literally is the standard for the length of video cards. Just in the past week, NVIDIA has announced, in fact, it's released the RTX 3080, and it's completely changed its reference design. Not only is the cooling different, but the length is different at 11.2 inches. It's abandoned the 10.6 inch reference design that it's used for about a decade. Before that, it was 9.5 inches. Now, the SG13 was designed around 10.6 inch GPUs. Well, that's not going to be a thing anymore going forward. High-end GPUs are going to be larger. And not only are they going to be longer, they're actually going to be wider as well. So this accommodates about the longest GPUs on the market plus triple slot GPUs, which you couldn't fit in the SG13 or a lot of other Mini-ITX chassis. So Silverstone really has that covered. You also have a lot of cooling options in here. You can fit a tower style air cooler. You can also fit an all-in-one liquid cooler up to 240 millimeters. I have one right here. I will be trying that out in the chassis to see how it works out. I'm actually going to do a few different options here in terms of layout and configuration. I'm not going to give it all away right now, but I have a few things in store because there's so many ways you can set up this chassis, which makes it actually pretty exciting, but also means I can't test it all. So I have a few things in mind. One thing I know, though, is that I will probably be doing a follow-up video, especially if you guys are interested in it, to show various different thermal setups for this case, perhaps with different aftermarket fans and other GPUs. I'm actually going to be testing with the RTX 2080 Ti. That's the one I've used for the past year in all of my other ITX chassis. Frankly, I was hoping to get a 3000 series GPU in for testing for this review, but I couldn't get one. And if I do get one, I'll use it in my follow-up review of the SG14 when I look at other thermal performance benchmarks. But for now, the RTX 2080 Ti will have to do. I think it's still pretty representative of modern GPUs. It's a 250 watt GPU, so it still puts out a lot of heat and will challenge this case. In terms of my CPU, I'm using a Ryzen 7 4750G from AMD. This is their 8-core 16-thread APU with built-in graphics. Now, the reason I'm using the 4750G is because it allows me to use a single Mini-ITX platform for all of my small form factor PC testing, including chassis that can't fit discrete video cards. Of course, I have a discrete video card for this test, so I won't be using the built-in Vega graphics, but it's there when I need it. Now, I know it's not available at retail, but for all intents and purposes, the 4750G will perform like a 3700X. So that's a pretty typical CPU going into Mini-ITX systems these days, so I do think it's pretty representative of what you guys might be using. And the other really interesting thing about this chassis is it allows you to use ATX power supplies. And that's kind of ironic given that Silverstone pioneered the SFX class of power supplies to aid the miniaturization of the PC market. Now, it just turns out that this actually may work out in Silverstone's favor. I do have an 850 watt Platinum unit, and with GPUs now going up to 350 watts, a lot of SFX class power supplies would have trouble handling the type of GPU you could actually fit in this chassis. So you get the better cooling of that larger ATX PSU, and of course you have higher ratings. You can get up to 1200 watts, I believe, in a 140 millimeter form factor. And you do want to stick with those shorter ATX power supplies. Don't want to go with some of the longer ones. They won't fit in this chassis. I believe the limit's 150 or 160, but I wouldn't even go there just to aid your cable management. Stick with 140 millimeter depth for your power supply. You'll still get pretty high wattage units available. So without further ado, let's take a look inside this chassis and get this system built up. So right off the bat, it's nice to see that Silverstone has gone with captive screws here. There are a lot of them. You do need to take off all 4 panels, top, bottom, left, and right, to build up the PC. So I'm going to take off the top and the left side here so you can see where the GPU would reside. Note that there is plastic mesh on the side panels. Not quite as nice as a nylon mesh, but it will still keep dust out of the system. Here's another view inside the system, and in terms of GPUs, the sky's the limit. You can have them as tall and as long as they come, and it'll take up to triple slot. This is where the power supply goes, and this is where the motherboard goes, of course, like a typical shoebox style case. But what Silverstone has done differently here is actually turned the power supply 90 degrees to allow for more space. So you actually mount it through the bottom of the chassis, and then you're going to have space for a 240 millimeter radiator right next to it, blowing out this side vent. You could also just fit 120 millimeter there. And then up here, you can fit a fan, but not a radiator. That is not a 120 millimeter radiator mount, just a 120 millimeter fan mount. Taking a look at the back of the case, you see that there is a 120 millimeter fan mounted from the factory. It does have holes for a 140 millimeter mount, and you could also potentially put a 140 millimeter radiator back here. Now I'm going to take off the right side panel to reveal the radiator mount. From the factory, it will fit a 120 or 140. If you want to use a 240 here, you're going to need to remove this optical drive bay. Actually, Silverstone tells me this is a very regional thing. Users in Japan are particularly picky about having that optical drive bay, but of course I am not, so I'm about to remove it. Now I've removed this optical drive bay and will never use it again, and probably neither will you, but it's there if you need it. Note that the radiator will fit like this, but keep in mind your power supply may be intaking air through this forward portion, so consider that if you're not using a radiator, you're going to want to take advantage of that free space. If you have a radiator though, you'll want to flip that power supply so it'll be taken out from the other side. And just note, here's that 240 millimeter length, so you do have a little bit of space to move back and forward, which you'll actually need to use to compensate for the space taken by the tubing. Now I'm going to demonstrate the unique power supply mounting system. Note that I am using an ATX class power supply in this ITX system, which is rather unusual, but it does allow me to have tons of power at a relatively low cost. Note that the vent goes up and the cables go down. You can point your fan either direction. I'm going to point it away from my cooler so that the power supply's fan is not fighting my radiator fans. And then I just slide it right in here. And then seen from the top of the chassis, you see the pigtail that connects it to the rear power connector, and then you just attach it with your typical 4 screws. Mounting the motherboard couldn't be easier thanks to the great access the SG14 provides, and then I'm ready to cable it up with my power supply cables and move to radiator installation. Alternatively, at this point, you could also drop in a tower-style air cooler. Again, this case is all about access, so I'm able to apply my thermal paste and install the cooling block all while the motherboard is inside the chassis. Here's that 240 millimeter radiator installed. It looks great from this angle, but there are 2 potential gotchas. First, your cooling block must be under 55 millimeters tall to fit under that fan. And second of all, you have to route these tubes very carefully so they don't get caught up in your fan blades. Now for my first run, I actually used a built-in Vega graphics on my 4750G APU. And without a video card taking up any space, you get a great view into this system while it's fully operational. And here it is with my RTX 2080 Ti installed. Frankly, this card looks tiny in this big ITX case. There's plenty of space for much larger cards. Now here's the system fully built up with the RTX 2080 Ti inside against this left side panel. This is a traditional shoebox style that Silverstone really helped pioneer, but a lot of competitors are going with a GPU down orientation, and Silverstone does include these rather chunky rubber feet that you can affix to the side panel so that your GPU can face down and you can get a little bit more on point style-wise. I'm going to bench it both ways. Starting with idle at the desktop, where we see the SG14 take a huge lead right from the start, whether in its standard shoebox orientation or flipped 90 degrees. Note that this is with the 4750G rather than the Ryzen 5 3600, but if anything, that would lead to higher temps, not lower temps. Moving on to the CPU-Z stress test, which I ran for 5 minutes, we again see that the SG14 is way ahead of the pack, including its brethren, the SG13 and the LDO3 airflow. It's also well ahead of Fantech's Evolve Shift Air, which ironically does have some airflow issues. Now keep in mind, this is not exactly an apples to apples comparison because the SG14 is running the new Ryzen 7 4750G 8-core CPU rather than the 6-core 3600, while at the same time it has the advantage of being able to fit the 240mm version of Silverstone's permafrost cooler rather than the 120 millimeter version. While the SG14 did really well in that CPU benchmark, in part thanks to the large 240 millimeter radiator it can fit, it actually did even better in the gaming benchmarks, and that's partly because of this traditional shoebox layout. It really is ideal. The GPU temps were lower than in some ATX cases I've tested, and it's also extremely quiet because that GPU doesn't need to spin up its fans. Also take note that I actually think the SG14 is better when run in the traditional shoebox layout rather than rotated 90 degrees, because when rotated like a lot of its competitors, that GPU waste heat goes up through the CPU cooler and heats up the CPU, whereas if you use the traditional shoebox layout, it just goes out the top of the case. All right, well, the results with that air-cooled RTX 2080 Ti were really impressive, but I also have a liquid-cooled GTX 1080 Ti that I've used in a number of my other ITX case reviews, and I thought I'd go ahead and try it in this case because Silverstone does market the case as being compatible not only with a 240 millimeter all-in-one CPU cooler, but also a 120 millimeter GPU cooler at the same time. Now, as I'm about to show you, it is a little bit of a stretch to say you could fit both of these in this case, but they're in here. I'm going to show you how I did it. I'm not necessarily going to recommend it, but you can do it. And then I'm going to show you the benchmarks of this GPU in this case. Let's see how it turns out. So there were a couple of challenges when installing the all-in-one cooler for the GPU. First of all, I had to go without a case fan because although the 120 millimeter model does fit on this bracket, it wouldn't fit inside the case with the GPU installed and the hoses sticking out of it. Then I had the hoses from the CPU cooler, which caused some more problems for fan clearance. See how I strapped it down, and even then, when mounted, I still had some issues with rubbing, and I also don't really love the contortion here of the GPU's hoses. They're under quite a bit of tension. In the end, the results look pretty good, but this is not something I'd recommend to a novice builder. Now, all of this could potentially be forgiven once you see these benchmarks. Look at the SG14, extraordinarily quiet and very, very cool at idle. Note that I've replaced the SG13 in these charts with the SV590 because the SG13 can only fit one all-in-one cooler, while the SV590 fits not only the GPU's all-in-one cooler, but a 240 millimeter all-in-one cooler as well, making it a true direct comparison with the SG14. In the CPU-Z stress test, the SG14 is way ahead. It's the coolest, it's the quietest, it's the winner. Finally, we get to our gaming benchmark, and this puts a load on both the CPU and the GPU, and overall, I like the SG14's noise profile and performance profile the most, but it does get beaten slightly by the Sliger SV590, which keeps the GTX 1080 Ti at 61 degrees versus 63. Keep in mind, it's the exact same GPU. The CPU temps are totally different though. The SG14 is way ahead despite being an 8-core versus a 6-core. With the same 240 millimeter all-in-one, it's at 53 degrees in this gaming benchmark, and that means it's overall much quieter at 38 decibels. It takes the win over the Sliger SV590 as the highest performing ITX case I have ever tested. All right, well, overall, this case is absolutely a winner. Look, I know that Silverstone has laid low for a while in the high-performance ITX market, while a whole lot of other manufacturers, particularly the small manufacturers, have come in to fill that void. But Silverstone knows this market well, and they did their research. The SG14 is amazing. It absolutely puts every other ITX case that I have tested to shame, and I know it could keep up with anything out there. Anything that's legitimately ITX, it could beat. Now, here's a couple of issues that I would raise about this design. First of all, while Silverstone has kind of jumped on the bandwagon and is marketing this as being able to flip 90 degrees, like a lot of other cases, more like the layout that you'd see in an ATX case with your GPU kind of at the bottom and then your CPU cooler at the top, I found that the results really weren't that great, and I had a problem with my liquid cooler. The fans kind of dropped down just a little bit due to gravity, and they started rubbing the liquid cooling hoses of that liquid cooler. I really recommend you just keep it down here planted, just like a standard shoebox case. I know it doesn't look quite as trendy, but it works just as well. And then the other thing that I have an issue with is I think that Silverstone is pushing some of its marketing a little bit far. Not only did I have a little trouble mounting that 240 millimeter all-in-one, I had a lot of trouble mounting the GPU liquid cooler, and it made the clearance issues all that much more challenging. So that's pretty much it. If that's like my biggest complaint, you know this SG14 is doing pretty well. I think the price is totally fair at $110. The performance is there. It's really well built. It allows you a lot of access. It's really easy to work with. Of course, until you try to fit a 240 millimeter all-in-one in there, then it gets a little bit tricky. You really have to manage the hoses to keep them out of the way of the fan blades, okay? So that's the only issue with this. But hey, it comes with the territory, and if you're considering any of the other smaller cases that compete with the SG14, you're definitely gonna have to deal with the hose issue as well. So really, I give this 5 out of 5 stars. I think this is SilverStone coming out swinging, and I'm totally excited about it. And if you've seen any of my previous reviews this year of SG cases, you know, even the SG13 I have issues with, and then some of their other ITX cases, I haven't given that high scores. So it's not like everything Silverstone does is perfect. This is pretty close to perfect. This is the case that I would build an ultra high performance ITX rig in, bar none. I wouldn't look at any of those boutique cases for twice as much. Just way too many problems, and I don't trust the thermals on those. I've tested this, I've benchmarked it, the thermals are fantastic. I would say they are potentially better than in an ATX case. That's how good the SG14 performs. So, hey, I'm excited about it. I hope you are too. If you have any questions, please post them down below. As always, I will do my best to get back to you. If you did enjoy the video, please do give me a like and subscribe. And it's particularly important for this video because I know a lot of you want me to do additional testing on this case, different components, different layouts, maybe some additional fans. I gotta see you guys interested in this video. So please do like and subscribe, share it with your subreddits, with your forums, wherever you participate. Share this review with them, get the word out. I'm excited about this, but I wanna know a lot of other people are excited about it as well. So that gives me some incentive to do more testing on the SG14 because I think this is a platform that's gonna be with us for a really long time. So as always, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I'll catch you next time.